Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero.
How heroic he comes
idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez said.
oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson. On this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast, I talked to Brandon Madsen. Brandon Madsen's a 33-year-old socialist based out of Portland, Oregon, and in his day job he works at a research lab at a local VA hospital. Brandon's been on the socialist left for more than a decade, and until recently he was an active member of Socialist Alternative, serving on the National Committee since 2007. He's been a rank-and-file member of DSA for 2 years, and recently joined the Reform and Revolution Caucus of DSA, that's been campaigning for DSA to actively start discussions on building towards a new working-class democratic socialist party. And in this episode, what I really wanted Brandon to do was just talk about why he joined DSA, why he thinks DSA is the organization to join, and how we see the role of DSA and other organizations in the larger socialist movement moving forward. So this is a really important conversation for me, and I think it really moved the needle for me a bit. And so I wanted Brandon to come on and give it to everybody else. So without further ado, here's Brandon Madsen on why you should join DSA. Brandon, thanks for coming on the Sensible Socialist Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So I want to, the way I start off with everybody is just to try to give a little bit of background. So give us a little bit of background on who you are, whether you consider yourself a socialist. If you do consider yourself a socialist, maybe what kind of socialist or what perspective you have on the more radical left.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I'm Brandon Madsen. I'm based out of Portland, Oregon right now. And I do consider myself a socialist. I've been a socialist for about 16 years now. And I guess sort of the way I got there is back in, I guess I was radicalized around 9/11, back when I was a freshman in high school. And that was sort of my wake-up call that, holy shit, there's so much going on in the world, and I have no idea what's behind any of it, and I have a lot to learn. And
my high school history teacher told me that we all had I walked into his office when the second plane hit, and he told us all, "Oh, you boys all better walk down to the recruiting office because this is your Pearl Harbor." And I went, "Holy shit!"
Yep. Yeah. So pretty quickly stumbled across some Noam Chomsky, trying to look up stuff on history of U.S.-Middle East relations, and quickly became a devotee of Noam Chomsky for a while. But I was I was never fully satisfied with. He's got a great crushing critique of capitalism and what's wrong with it, but when it comes to what do I do? How do we get from point A to point B? I felt like his answers were always pretty hand wavy and not that satisfying in terms of go join a group or get active in your community or something. And the theory of revolution was kind of we'll smash the state and then free association will happen, and it just
right.
Anyway, so yeah, I eventually met some socialists, bought a socialist newspaper, got in discussions, and have been on the organized, socialist left ever since. Been a DSA member for about 2 years now. And was a member of Socialist Alternative until recently. Still really respect the work going on there, and a lot of good things to say about them, and want to keep working closely with them. But ultimately, I feel like DSA is the place to be organized for socialists right now, and as I understand, that's a lot of what you wanted to have me on to talk about. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we, in full disclosure, we had a really interesting discussion in which you kind of went over some of these things and really got my gears kind of turning. And I've been myself toying with the idea of joining DSA for a number of different reasons, and just hearing your perspective, did move the needle a bit. So I wanted to kind of allow you the chance to give that perspective. So in a very open-ended question, I would just ask, why should I join the Democratic Socialists of America? Yeah.
Well, first off, it's the third largest socialist organization in U.S. history, and I think it is not your daddy's DSA. It has changed since from what it was before Trump's election, and I think is really, it's the mainstream. It's the epicenter of the socialist movement today, and it's exciting to me, frankly, having been doing this during the first half of my socialist career, being quite dark times for socialists to try and organize, to even be able to talk about a socialist movement as opposed to a handful of holdovers from earlier times together with a tiny sprinkling of young radical people or whatever. Yeah. But now that you have tens of thousands of people who are active and organized on the socialist left in the U.S., I think that's a great development. And to me, this is where the conversations are happening in terms of where people are going when they say Trump got elected and I want to fight back, and how do I do that? And what I consider to be a lot of the healthiest political layers of people that want to do something about that drift towards DSA in large numbers. The same thing happened when Bernie dropped out of the primaries. Just recently, there's been another flood of several thousand more into DSA, and I think if that keeps up, then is on track to eventually become an organization of 100,000 plus, which I would consider to be not relative to the size of the U.S. as a whole, still maybe not what you'd consider a mass formation, though the line there is a bit fuzzy of where you would start saying that, but certainly would be among the most significant formations on the left in the history of the United States, so I just think the raw potential there is huge, and I think there's a lot of people who are just really genuinely trying to figure stuff out and where to go next, and obviously we're all trying to figure that out, and it's a question that doesn't just have one answer that you come up with and stick to, so it's a dialogue, but I have my thoughts on that, other people have their thoughts, and I just want to be in the middle of that conversation and in the middle of the movements of people who are trying to figure out basically how do we build power for working people, because to me whatever comes next, because there were things before DSA, I'm sure there will be things after DSA when things reach different stages, but I think whatever the bigger, better thing that comes next is, I think more than anywhere else, the forces that are going to make up that thing are probably going to find themselves in or around DSA if they're not there already in the years ahead. And so to me, I want to be right in the middle of that process, and I want to help push that forward in what I see as the best possible direction. So I want to be part of that.
So you did say that it's not that the modern DSA, the DSA post-Trump, let's say, is not your daddy's DSA, and I think that there's a lot of people, and I think for good cause, who have a sort of problem with your daddy's DSA. The sort of Michael Harrington legacy is one of, I think, in many ways, attempting to and actually having the effect of moving the Democratic Party in a more leftward direction towards more social democratic kinds of ideas rather than, you know, more mainstream or centrist kind of bourgeois democratic ideas, if you will. And so there are, I think, a lot of people, especially, you know, in the media analysis kind of world, who see DSA as more of an influence group within or related to an influence group that of the Democratic Party that moves them, you know, to the left, but doesn't really do much beyond that. That it's kind of, you know, it's kind of like unions and other groups within the Democratic Party who they are involved in the Democratic Party. They're solid Democratic Party voters. They're an easy thing for the Democratic Party to sort of ignore, but they do have a minor influence on at least some of the members of the Democratic Party, moving them left. So when you say it's not your daddy's DSA, is it not that organization, and what has changed in your eyes?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and it's a crucial question to me, because I think if it was the DSA of pre-2016, you know, I would not even consider for a moment it being a place to orient to. I had never considered it before that. And I think, like, for those who don't know, like, its origins was as a, you know, a democratic pressure group, effectively, and of trying to, and explicitly sort of, anti-communist socialist group, trying to work within the Democratic Party as being the only sort of possible way to get stuff done. And I really disagree with that, and I think actually the key task for the socialist and workers' movements right now is to find a way to stand on their own 2 feet and have an organization that isn't dependent on the Democratic Party. And so I think that's one of the big questions that's being debated right now. Right now, DSA is more of a big tent organization. You have your, you know, libertarian socialists, you've got your, you know, Marxist-Leninist, Maoist, whatever. You've got all sorts of stuff. You've got your people. Sorry, my cat still wants to be on your podcast. You've got your democratic loyalists. You've got your sort of eclectic independent leftists of various stripes, and you know, I think you've got lots of different trends of socialism. Some of them organized, some of them not so organized. You know, within DSA, that are all kind of trying to figure out a way forward. And you know, to me, this is a very different. This isn't just not your daddy's DSA, but it's, you know, not the socialist left generally of an earlier period. In that, I think you now have like a layer. There was a time when pretty much everybody on the left knew everybody else, and it was all just like these the activists were primarily old-timers left over from before the collapse of Stalinism, the few that clung tightly to their ideals, and, you know, they weren't moving anytime soon, and there wasn't really broader movements to test ideas out in, and so it was just kind of, you know, trying to hold on to what you have and maybe recruit in the 1s or 2s or whatever at a time, and just kind of really carefully weather the storm of the 90s and the 2000s or whatever. But, you know, come the Occupy movement, you know, you start to see, or really, actually, in my mind, the starting point was Wisconsin 2011 in February, when the movement against Scott Walker broke out. But the reference point for a lot of people would be Occupy later that year. I think, you know, you've seen a process set in motion that's been, that of course itself was linked to the economic crisis, the last one, and you know, that it just takes time to play out. But now you have an activist layer that is fresh, genuine people trying to figure stuff out, grappling with ideas that aren't sort of the crystallized, hardened, you know, old timers of the movement or whatever, but are, and even some of the people that are old timers are also questioning their ideas and trying to figure things out anew because of the new context and the fact that there are these real mass movements to test ideas out in. And so I think, there's a dynamism there that just wasn't there before. But also, crucially, I think at the last convention that DSA had nationally, they debated whether they should have, you know, in their platform the idea of having the goal of establishing an independent party for working people. And you know, there was debate and there wasn't full agreement, there wasn't consensus on that reached, but the majority voted that yes, that should be in the platform, that the goal, whatever our differences might be on how to get there, the goal is to have an independent party of by and for working people. And to me, that's a great starting point. And it's one of the things that really drew me to want to go into DSA, is the idea, like, yeah, I totally want to have that conversation of, like, I want to do that, and I want to talk about how we can do that. And I want to be part of a movement of people that are trying to find a way to do that. Because I do think that's sort of the next strategic, necessary task on the path between here and getting to socialism, is figuring out how to do that. So yeah, I think that's something the old DSA would never have, really been dealing with. I think, as opposed to the sort of long-term strategy of embedding within the Democratic Party and trying to shift it left, I think now you have a more impatient layer of people, impatient in a good way, that, when they work through the Democratic Party, they're not doing with the idea like, oh, okay, we're going to slowly move this party left, or we're going to win it over, or whatever. I mean, some people maybe, but I'd say the dominant idea is more like, we're trying to build a coherent political nucleus inside the Democratic Party, and once it has enough strength, we want to break it out of the Democratic Party. And I think, I have my own take on the strategy or whatever, and I'm sure we can talk about that. But to me, that is a very different, starting point than what the starting point of the DSA 5 years ago would have been.
Yeah, so you did mention that DSA is essentially, like, right now, it is kind of a nebulous organization. It's very multi-tendency. It has a lot of different, streams and streaks running through it. But in some ways, I can see that as a benefit to the organization, that there are a lot of these different opinions, and it's a way for people to kind of try out different things and learn a lot of different ideas, and to kind of explore for themselves where they fit into the larger context. And I do think it's important, as somebody who's much more cosmopolitan of a socialist than I think a lot of socialists tend to be. There's tend to be a sort of sectarianness about a lot of socialist thinking, and I am so not that way. Like, I'm very interested in talking and exploring the ideas with anybody. We've had we've had episodes on Maoism. We've had libertarian socialism. I just had a conversation with Albert Lee, who is of the idea that the Democratic Party moving it to the left is the only way to go, and that's his position. And okay, that's a position. As long as you have reasons to hold it, I'm interested in having that discussion. So there's an aspect that's really helpful for the multi-tendency organization in that respect. In the other respect, in terms of the organizing space, while experiments can happen and are definitely happening within DSA, I think there's, stomp out slumlords and different, actions that they're doing are really effective. The ability to have a sort of political consolidation and a sort of unified whole of the organization that would be essential, especially when you're kind of come up against the onslaught of the two different parties. If you're talking about starting another party and the difficulties that you're going to face, you need to have some coalescing around at least a certain core set of ideas that you would have your unity of vision on within the organization, which is difficult in that multi-tendency organization. So do you see the fact that it is this multi-tendency nebulous kind of organization as a major hindrance, as a positive, or how do you view this sort of weird place, this big tent, and it's a big tent? Mm-hmm. How does this play into? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it neutral? How do you see it?
I guess the way I would see it in my paradigm is like it's a stage of development that it's passing through, right? Like, so,
okay.
The organizations that I don't think that this is like some unique property to like DSA in its history. Like, I think this is many of the both the pros and the cons of what DSA is, like both the limitations and the possibilities of what's in it are things that you would probably have in any comparably sized socialist group that you were to form today, regardless of how it came about or what its history was or its peculiarities of how it's run or whatever. Like, I just think, the state of the movement at the present time, like the reality is there isn't clarity on these things. And so you can't like, it isn't an organizational question to force that kind of clarity. It's not like you can create that by just someone says it or whatever, or like forcing it on people. Like you have to go through that process of testing ideas out, of discussing them, of coming back and analyzing after, having experiences, testing them out, and people will elect different people into different leadership roles around that, and whether their ideas played out well or whatever, and people will make different votes at conventions and things like that. And I think it's all part of the process. But I do think that one of the questions that people are grappling with is like, hey, there's all of these candidates that have run, invoking their either being members of or endorsed by the DSA, as part of their running, and they're in office, and they sort of run the gamut from being like high profile and generally seen quite positively by the left, your AOC or what have you, to other candidates that just sort of haven't, as far as I can tell, done that much with their position, and maybe just post some things on Twitter or whatever, but otherwise haven't really made a splash and used their position to its full potential necessarily. And I think people or even may have voted a way that most DSA members would consider wrong on different issues. And so there's this idea of like, okay, well, how do we have like our candidates, and like how do we hold those people accountable to the movement as a whole, to a set of ideas that we thought we were voting for them on the basis of, and how do we like make the most out of these positions? And I think, that's one of the conversations that for me ties into the need for a new party. In a lot of ways, I think DSA is doing a lot of the things that a party would ideally do, running campaigns on issues, having an internal democratic structure where people can debate and discuss what to do and what positions on issues should be, running candidates in elections. But I think none of that is done in as sort of fully conscious a way as it could be. Like it's in most DSA chapters that I'm aware of, there isn't, it's not like the chapter really gets together and puts their heads together and says, you know what, let's like really focus our resources on this point of attack and like let's just go do it as a team. It's more like a bunch of different little groups sort of have their little projects and they're working on them, and like that's fine. It's good to have space to test those ideas, and I'm not saying that like organizationally it should necessarily be forced into not doing that, but I do think a sort of voluntary centralization of resources in the sense of like choosing to hey, wouldn't it be great if we could all decide to work on this project together and really focus our resources there. We could make a big splash. And I think DSA in a lot of ways like has a lot more potential right now to be a powerful force in society than it is fully aware of, I think, than the leadership is aware of, than most members are aware of. I think if tapped properly, like it really could be a huge force to be reckoned with. I think a lot of that, the conversations still need to be had to get there, but I think the latent potential is just huge, and it's only going to grow in the period ahead. As far as I can see, there are no other sort of contenders on the field to absorb the sort of new radicalizing layers of people that are coming out of the movements and are likely going to be coming out of the woodwork whenever the lockdowns end and whatever, and want to go protest and stuff.
Which I think you might have quite a few people who are going to come out of this and say, I need to find a more radical organization because the shit is not working, and they're waiting to be able to go to an actual meeting and do all that kind of stuff. But to me, DSA is really, it seems like it's a great place for experimentation and for learning, but it has organizational barriers to being more effective in some kind of national way, let's say, in some kind of national coordinated effort or something like that you see in, I think, certain sort of chapters of DSA and certain organizations. in certain localities will be more or less effective. But as a sort of national organization, coalescing around certain things and doing projects that are oriented towards those seems to be much more difficult for the organization. And so, you know, I think coming from an organization that is explicitly democratic centralist, like Socialist Alternative, you can see, like for me, with the experience of Socialist Alternative, you can see the benefits of a democratic socialist perspective. You can see the deficits of democratic centralism, you know, depending on the different features of the organization, the situation it finds itself in, for a lot of different reasons. And not necessarily that there's something wrong with democratic centralism itself, but it's difficult. It's a difficult organizational model in difficult times, obviously. So, you know, compared to a more straight up, what we might say, Bolshevist organization or organization, you might have more ability to have these kind of national actions that are organized towards specific things, and the organization sort of as a whole coalesces around them and works on those, and the vision becomes bigger, and you have the ability of something like Socialist Alternative, which is frankly relatively small, being able to capture an elected office in a fairly large city. So, you know, there's organizational benefits to that kind of organization. There are drawbacks, and we can talk about those, but I mean, there are benefits to it that I think would really help DSA. But DSA is not a democratic centralist organization. So, you know, you have a lot of experimentation, but and some important things that happen, but you don't have this ability to coalesce the organization, like the rest of the membership. So what do you think? I mean, how do you see the role of democratic centralism? You know, in some ways generally, but in its application to DSA specifically, is DSA ripe for that right now? Do you think it will have to eventually sort of come to that, or how do you see the role of democratic centralism, especially from the perspective of an organization that doesn't have it, and from my perspective, seriously needs it?
Well, first, I guess I feel like the term democratic centralism needs some unpacking. So I'm going to do that before I get into the answer, which is just...
Makes sense.
Because, well, so just to recognize off the bat, you know, DSA, one of its features is that currently, you know, it is cause for expulsion to be a member of a democratic centralist, you know, organization. And so, you know, that's right in the statutes of the organization. I'm not saying
I guess that's a holdover from your daddy's DSA.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And in fact, I think the intention there was like, you know, the worry was, you know, people are members of the, you know, Stalinized Communist Party or whatever, and are coming in as agents of Moscow or whatever, you know.
Yeah, sure.
And so, because that was, you know, the biggest organization by far, you know, that professed to use democratic centralism at the time. But that's sort of what I mean is like, I think that there's a lot of like, what is democratic centralism is almost as contentious a question as what is socialism, in the sense of you ask 10 different people, you'll get 10 different answers, or you ask the same person at 10 different times and you'll get 10 different answers. And so like, I guess like, I'm not like gonna go into I'm not gonna tell you like what's the right term and what's the wrong, or the right definition and what's the wrong definition for that term. But what I will do is just, rather than talking about the pros and cons of that term, I'm just gonna talk about the qualities that I think the organization should or couldn't have.
More useful anyway. So,
yeah, I think that sort of the most bare bones and classical definition of that I've heard of democratic centralism is the idea that you, you know, have full freedom of discussion but unity in action, and I think, in that stripped down version, I think it is absolutely a good model for the type of organization that we need to build going forward. You know, I'm not saying that, whatever, I'm not on some saying the DSA needs to turn into that, you know, in the moment, but I think like the goal in terms of like what is the party that socialists need to build ultimately if we want to be successful in the long run, I think that is what we need. We need to have a culture that is extremely open and democratic, where you can discuss without any sort of restriction. You can say, you know, what you want. You can publish your own publications. You can, you know, disagree with each other or whatever. But at the same time, you know, when the organization undertakes some, you know, initiative, you know, no one is like doing anything to like actively undermine that initiative or whatever, you know, like that everyone's kind of supporting each other in trying to accomplish the same things when they're agreed democratically within the organization. And also that I think, you know, if you get someone from that organization elected, that they are obligated to vote the way that the organization instructs them to, if they instruct them on any specific votes. So I think that those concepts of, you know, sort of basic unity and accountability combined with democracy, I think those are great qualities that an organization should have. I think, you know, most real life definitions of what democratic centralism has meant in terms of like, if you look at groups that have called themselves that, I think like you get lots of different twists on you know, lots of different extra stuff piled on top of that, some of which might be good or bad or whatever. And so I don't really, I see the rest as unnecessary and window dressing and totally conjunctural, like as in there isn't one model of how to organize that you just keep forever. I think it's going to be situation dependent. And, you know, if you look at, like, to be clear, I do support a Bolshevist model in the sense of pre-1917 Bolsheviks, like before taking power. I think, you know, it gets messier after that because they're working in really not ideal circumstances of trying to, you know, hold out against civil war and invasion and whatever. And I think do a lot of things that, you know, you can argue about whether they were right or not, but they certainly seemed necessary at the time. And, you know, like
you might not do if you hadn't been invaded.
Yep, I think there's plenty of stuff that there's a lot of things that fall into the category of don't go making a virtue out of necessity situation. So like, there's stuff where it's like, you know, it's hard to, I don't want to like, be the judge of how people acted in a situation that I've, you know, can't imagine being in.
Exactly.
But I can say that there's a lot of ways that the Bolsheviks organized themselves that would not like be transportable. Like you don't just take that model and plug it into 2020 USA. But I think like if you look at the Bolsheviks in their whole history, like they did, like they called themselves democratic centralists the whole time, but they went through lots and lots of different forms of organization, you know, depending on, you know, how repressive were the laws at the time and, you know, how secretive did they have to be, depending on how big was the mass movement around them, you know, whether to have an open door policy or more of a strict criteria for membership, you know, like a lot of things were really flexible. And to me, actually, despite the caricatures of Lenin, like the real Lenin is defining quality as being ridiculously flexible on organizational questions and willing to bend over backwards to be accommodating to whatever, you know, is going to be smoothest and work on organizational questions, but absolutely intransigent about always being able to argue for his political ideas. And so, to me, we should have an organization like that that's very, very flexible organizationally, and there's lots of, you know, you can be nimble and move with what the situation demands, but we absolutely are intransigent about the idea that everyone retains the right to argue their political ideas without restriction, and that basically have faith in the process that through doing that, through having honest, open dialogue and maintaining that type of flexibility, we will be able to weather different storms as well as take advantage of different opportunities as they arise.
And in that sense, you know, I think that I've been doing a lot of study about different kinds of decision-making models, in particular collaborative environments, starting to work, or co-op. So we're having to talk about collaborative decision-making and different ways of doing that, and what democracy really means, and does it just look like majority vote, and a lot of those kind of things. And I think one of the things I've learned is how important the establishment of democratic culture is if you're going to maintain any kind of democratic decision-making or democratic processes in an organization. And I think one thing that if you have organizations that spring up like a communist party after 1917 that is in some ways dictated to have democratic centralism without a long tradition of democratic organization within the organization, then the democratic aspect of democratic centralism takes a backseat to the centralism. And so when you look at DSA, I think what is interesting about DSA is that you can see, especially now in this particular period, it has a relatively democratic culture, I would say, right? It has to, because of these competing multi-tendencies and the sort of competing for attention and competing in terms of what direction the organization should go in. And there are robust debates at convention and things like that, because there are a lot of different places that people are coming through. You're not talking about a monolithic organization that has democratic processes that just rubber stamp everything that the executive of the organization sort of promulgates. And so I think the DSA has the unique position of, if you wanted to establish genuine democratic centralism, if you call that, but we could call it democracy, full democracy in debate and unity in action, if you want to call it that, then
democratic unity, maybe.
Yeah, I mean in some ways that's democracy. It's like you don't even need the centralism kind of part of it. It's what a democracy genuinely is, right? Democracy is a model to get some kind of consensus, not necessarily the truth, but consensus among competing groups. And it's a good way to find an answer that is satisfying enough to at least enough of the organization to make it legitimate. And again, there's different democratic models that you can do that is not just simply majority votes and stuff like that. And you can enhance your democratic culture while even in some ways enhancing the centralization that you can do once you make the decision making. But I also think the two things are connected in the sense that if you don't have genuine democratic decision-making as your model, the acts that the organization will eventually enact and go towards will not be genuinely followed by the organization because it didn't feel like it was involved democratically. And so these two things really coalesce into sort of one major thing. And that's why I say, ultimately it's democracy. Genuine democracy will, in theory, produce centralized kinds of actions because the process of democracy will give you consent. And consent is what gives legitimacy to govern and move in that kind of direction. And so the democratic centralist organizations that I've been a part of have almost all been lacking in the democracy aspect, the genuine kind of democracy aspect of it. And I was not in those organizations long enough to really do enough deep dive into the democratic traditions that the organization had before really establishing a sort of goal towards using democratic centralism. But when I look at DSA, it doesn't have this forced democratic centralism, but it's got a lot of the democracy aspects. And so with very little effort, and I think with just a bit of organization and a bit of structure, DSA could really engender a genuine democratic mood and organization and decision-making model that might give it the ammunition to really coalesce, and especially if it was running candidates and things like that and having a platform, I think that would be a way to do that. I mean, I think that's the only, it gives me hope that a genuine democratic centralist organization could emerge out of what you see DSA being now, which is in some ways a multi-tendency, swirling molecule of different kinds of organizational ideas and perspectives. I don't know.
Sure. But it's a major step up from, say, the Occupy movement or whatever in terms of organization, right? It's that was
anyone who was involved in Occupy. It was the most frustrating decision model you could ever fucking come up with.
Yeah. I mean, that was
fucking finger flips, man. And raising your hand. Oh God.
No, it's but that too. I mean, that was, yes, it was frustrating, but it was also, I think, an inevitable and necessary stage, that things were going to go through, and that, the best people who are going to stick out, this trying to make change thing for the long run, are going to draw conclusions out of those experiences, and I think did draw conclusions out of those experiences. And I think the same thing is happening and will continue to happen now, that people's ideas are totally they don't catch up to events in real time, but there's a processing lag or whatever, but people process the things that they recently experienced and draw conclusions from them and implement those moving forward. And I do think that right now there's going to be people asking, what's the balance sheet of this Bernie Sanders campaign that just happened, and what was good about it and what was lacking, and what's the balance sheet of all these candidates that have run under the DSA name and gotten elected? What have they accomplished that's positive? What are the limitations? And is there anything we can do about it? And I think this idea of how to link the I think a lot of people I know currently within the DSA sphere can get into these camps of one that's really, more electoral focused, and one that's more elections are a waste of time, we should just do base building. And I mean, to me, the whole question is, how do you link those things really organically so that election campaigns are really just a generalization of the work you're doing anyway in the communities on issues. And to me, that's part of what it means to launch a party, or to relaunch oneself as a party, or whatever, would be to, right now the model is that people as individuals decide they're going to run for some office, and then after the fact they go to DSA and say, hey, will you endorse my campaign or whatever. And that's, you get maybe some leverage with that or whatever, but though actually you also nowadays, I think, see some, careerist Democratic types that look to the DSA as oh, here's this ready-made campaigning apparatus for me if I decide I'm going to go with a left persona for this or whatever. Take it out of the box and it works. And, I think, DSA is also conscious of not wanting to be used that way, and so I think, there's going to be a searching of how do you, hold politicians genuinely accountable and not, allow oneself to be in that position. And I think people want to figure out the answer to that. But to me, it comes with the organization as a whole deciding to not just endorse candidates that are running, but to run candidates out of its ranks, to basically say, hey, we should run for this set of offices and to vote on that, and to have people do that. And I also think, linking up explicitly with other social movement organizations to try and bring them in on that process would also be part of launching or relaunching as a new party, in the sense of bringing in, unions, women's organizations, environmental organizations, trying to integrate those into this body that takes a politically independent stance. And I think, regardless of what tactic you use in terms of ballot lines and whatever in any given race, that's going to be a step forward from just not having that process. I tend to think there's a ton of races where you could absolutely just run on a socialist ballot line, on a democratic socialist ballot line, and should do that in the vast majority of cases. Because there's just, districts are so gerrymandered now. Most of them are one-party districts anyway. It seems seems like it's the exception when there's a genuine toss-up between which party's gonna.
Or in big cities, particularly too. I think that's really where you have a lot of congressional districts, within cities that are solely Democratic, you know, I mean, Albert Lee's race is a perfect example. Like if he was a DSA candidate, all of a suddenly now we have an interesting race. Whereas even if it's within the Democratic Party, it's less so because the party can tip its, you know, put its feet on the scales.
Well, in all due respect to Albert Lee, who's, you know, here in Portland, like I am, you know, I think you know, to me, that actually is why I don't agree with the conclusion that that it's necessary to, you know, work within the Democratic Party and move it to the left in that context, because, yeah, I mean, it's one thing if you're looking at, say, like the presidential race or whatever, then that holds real weight, and you have to take that question really seriously. But if you're looking at Portland, where every office is going to have a Democrat in it or whatever, like, yeah, there's no spoiler effect to be worried about or whatever if you don't win. So why not, you know, take the opportunity to build structural power for a politically independent alternative thing that you could start building a base for. To me, that's the direction we should move in. But I also think, yeah, we should have that conversation, and that's one of the main reasons I'm really excited to join DSA. Well, I've been in DSA, but to really focus more on the conversations inside DSA on this, because I do think there's just so much space, and it's a question people are asking, you know, what next, especially after the Bernie campaign.
You're hinting at it, and I think there will be some disillusionment with the whole notion of electoral politics coming out of the failure of the Bernie Sanders campaign to capture the Democratic nomination, which I think was probably a long shot to begin with, but was pretty amazing. He got as far as he did, and it took, you know, somebody like Barack Obama and other people to tip the scales in a way that was going to, you know, screw Bernie, which I think if you didn't already know, that should be the last thing that you ever need to know about Barack Obama, what he says from his perspective, and hope and change my ass. But a conversation that you're going to have within DSA, specifically among the libertarian socialist comrades for whom I have a soft spot in my heart. I in some ways, deep down inside, probably consider myself a libertarian socialist. You know, again, I'm too cosmopolitan to put my finger on one particular position, but there is the strand in DSA of the libertarian socialists seem to be very, very, very critical of the entire running in the electoral system, and there is an argument, a long argument on the socialist left about the lack of, there's no utility in engaging in bourgeois democratic politics, that it's simply a reification of the system. You're just participating in the same way. You'll get corrupted in the same way. It's not useful to do, that you better be focused on sort of groundswell movements. And you've kind of, you know, said your position on that, but I'm curious to get a flavor of what your argument would be with a libertarian socialist DSA comrade who is fervently against the notion of participation in bourgeois politics.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think, well, first off, I just want to acknowledge that, yeah, libertarian socialists locally are doing some of the best work on the ground in terms of the housing movement and things like that, so I just want to give credit where credit's due, and certainly the fact that we disagree on this does not mean, you know, that we respect each other any less. But, but yeah, I think for me, and actually also I'll start out by pointing out something I really agree with the critique of electoral politics as a focus, which is that, you know, as a Bolshevik-style revolutionary socialist, I believe that we're not ultimately going to achieve socialism through the electoral process within the capitalist system. I think that even if you did, even if somehow, you know, you elected a socialist, like a real honest-to-God revolutionary socialist into the, you know, presidency of the United States, you know, that the capitalist class is not going to just go, oh, good job, you beat us at our own game, here's the keys to the kingdom, have fun running everything, you know, that... Yeah. That has never happened in history, that a ruling class has just, you know, decided, oh, good, you...
Yeah, a democratic election does not usually make a revolution.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think if you, you know, look at Chile in the 1970s. You can see what happens when you elect a socialist through the proper channels, and business doesn't like it.
Or Venezuela today, or you could name a number of examples.
Becomes a scrap of paper, and you pretty much if it's as long as it stops being useful, once it stops being useful for keeping people in line, it goes out the window. And so having said that, and acknowledged that yes, it's absolutely true that that is not like where the real lever to gain power is. I think that most people are too focused, people who are political at all anyway, are too focused in the other direction. The first and in many cases only place they look to see political change happen is running candidates, voting in elections, whatever, sort of the default place you go to do that. And I personally am not willing to cede that ground to the corporate media, to the capitalist narrative. I think our goal, while being honest about what we think is objectively going to be necessary, is to try and build a bridge back to where people are actually at. Our starting point is we think we need socialism, and here's how we get there. But then you got to translate that into where are people coming from right now, and to be I want to be wherever people are moving into action, trying to change stuff. And there's a whole layer of people, especially if you look at the Bernie Sanders campaign that just ended or whatever, that only get mobilized into action when there's some political electoral campaign going on, and but who are trying genuinely to use it to change things. They aren't just some cynical player in the game or whatever. They're really trying to use it. And so we don't want to be on the sidelines denouncing those people or letting them just get discouraged and burn out or whatever. We want to be there fighting alongside them, saying yeah, I want these things you're fighting for too. I warn you that these are the obstacles you're going to come up against, and that's why I think we can't rely on these politicians to get stuff done for us, and we need to organize ourselves. But I want these same things, and I'm right in the fight alongside you. Let's do this together. But this is my perspective and the warnings I'm going to put forward. And I think, when people test out those ideas, when people start moving into action, they can see what works and what doesn't. And if, you can make predictions and those get borne out, that's a helpful way of giving credence to your analysis and winning people over to a more movement-based strategy and by movement I mean broader than just an electoral movement that's based on trying to capture independent power through mass organizing in the working class, in communities, in schools, in neighborhoods, in workplaces. And that said, I think even when you move beyond the sort of voting for capitalist politicians sort of thing, even then when people are organized in the streets, the workplaces, the neighborhoods, the schools in big numbers, I think then actually it also becomes quite powerful to run candidates, because it's taking all these disparate struggles, in different locations, in different communities, in different workplaces, and linking them up and saying, here's this common thread running through them. Here's the political generalization of this thing that we're fighting for. So it sort of names it and gives it a coherent structure around it. And it also, I think, no matter how big and powerful your movements are, you never have brought in everybody yet, and there still is going to be, as long as the electoral system is still standing, there's going to be some layer of people that still have some illusions in it or faith in it, and so you gotta, if you never want to rest on your laurels, and you want to keep winning wider and wider layers of people over to your program and continue to engage through those mechanisms, and even to try and pass things through the official channels, if only to show and expose the limits of the system, and to try and break through them and say, look, we did everything and tried to do it this way, and it doesn't, here's what we run up against. That's why we need to, put pressure from outside the system. Yeah.
Yeah. So the one question I was curious to sort of get your opinion on is the relationship between DSA and traditional labor unions. The labor unions have been sort of in the pocket of the Democrats for a long time. Frankly, I have, a serious critique of modern labor unions and their inefficacy and their inability to organize as, in whatever way they can cross organizationally and within wider sectors, that the labor unions tend to create their own labor aristocracy kind of ideas. I think that you have a whole almost class in and of itself, the labor leadership and their disconnection with the rank and file. And so what position do you see, what position does DSA have vis-a-vis labor unions sort of right now? Are there any sort of DSA-run labor unions or ones in which DSA has kind of infiltrated and plays a role in? Or is it very tangential? And I think, where is it, I'm curious where it is now and where you think it needs to be in terms of organized labor. I mean, this is a whole other question itself in terms of the modern role of organized labor and how what degree it genuinely organizes the working class and to what ends. So I think that's a long discussion that we don't necessarily need to get into, but I'm curious about DSA's relationship with even just traditional labor unions, or even different workplace organization structures like worker cooperatives and other kinds of things. How is DSA? What is DSA doing in the organizing, the labor organizing department?
Yeah, I think it's mixed. I think DSA absolutely has a real presence in the labor movement and is a factor in the labor movement. And I think, again, this is the relationship is in flux compared to what it used to be in the old DSA, where I think like the old DSA, I think one of the main sources of their mostly paper membership pre-2016 was like labor leaders was my feel, in that pretty much everyone I met, in DSA before 2016 was a labor leader of some sort.
Goes along with the anti-communism of DSA too.
Yeah, I guess so. So I think some of those ties are new dynamic ones. Some of them are the old ties or whatever. And I think that said, the relationship is I think it's still being defined. But that said, there are certain industries or areas where DSA has a presence, disproportionately high presence, which I would say the teachers' unions are the one that stands out to me, especially the opposition caucuses within the teachers' unions around the country. I think DSA members played a really important role in what happened in West Virginia with the teachers and in many of the other Red State Revolt sort of situations that broke out. And so I think that there are some industries where DSA has a really big foothold and could be a force to be reckoned with. And I think the teachers' unions is one of those. And certainly I think like they would be very, very well positioned to develop and implement a conscious strategy for what the teachers movement should look like or whatever, and be able to push for that within the teachers unions. So I think you're somewhere it's like that. There's other situations where, DSA has, little to no like organized presence inside the unions, but I think with lots of unions, they have like sort of a working relationship with or whatever, like with a sort of alliance with or whatever. I guess like, I think a lot of times, well, I don't know. I don't want to overgeneralize. So, but I think, one thing that I think that I have seen in some instances, like that DSA will just sort of act as foot soldiers for whatever the union's already doing, rather than sort of playing the political role and, trying to fight for its ideas within the unions. And so I think that's something I would like to see, change a little more, that it's not just union solidarity stuff of like playing the role of the community allies and the like, let's come give reinforcements, nor is it just doing the work of salting or whatever, which that's a big part of, I think, what the labor group does here. And I mean, salting is totally worthwhile to do, but I think it's, I think it's the type of thing that probably you want to send some of your more like hardened, experienced labor veterans in to do, because it's not easy work.
Can you explain what salting is?
Yeah. So salting is when you send a few convinced union activists into an ununionized workplace and try and have them be sort of the seeds around which a union can be built. Usually they end up being sort of sleeper cells that, come into action when some dispute breaks out, like when conditions are right. And in the meantime is sort of building up very, very slowly and carefully, one at a time, like a circle around themselves or whatever, to try and expand whatever base of power. But, it's very tough work. It's very tricky work. It's very careful work. It's slow, tedious, patient, painful work that, definitely is good and needs to be done. But it's not. To me, it's a good way to disillusion or burn out someone who's totally new to it.
Sure.
I'm new and joined DSA. I went to the Labor Caucus meeting. What should I do? Well, go get a job here and salt.
Right.
To me, that's like, whoa. But so yeah, I think like there's a lot of places that are where, because I really agree with you in a lot of ways that the unions are really, the union leadership is totally inadequate, and most unions around the country are not willing to do the types of things that it's going to take to actually win the contracts that are needed. They're still in, mode of class snuggle rather than class struggle. They're sort of have been slow to realize that the social contract has been torn up long ago and not in the 50s anymore or whatever. And so I do think it's going to require a new layer, a new generation of labor activists coming to the fore that do not have the same illusions in the slow, steady process to get things done. And I also think, we're going to have to be open to, more ad hoc groupings of workers that don't go through all the official union creation process or whatever, in that, I think ultimately you do want to try and create something stable like that. But, if a struggle breaks out in a workplace, like, to me, like, you don't wait around and say, like, we need to go through union certification process and whatever. Like, no, just like start electing people, like start organizing yourselves, like on whatever unofficial basis you need to make this thing work, right?
You can get bogged down in the details, the legal details and things like that very quickly, and that may, in fact, extinguish what fire there was, towards a unionization process. So artificially forcing it through intentionally limited channels, which is what the labor law is. Labor law in the United States is not giving things to workers, really. It's more about restricting the right while pretending that you have them.
Yeah, so if unions aren't willing to, break unjust laws in order to win fights, they're not going to win those fights. And ultimately the power is in the numbers, and all they can ever do is make an example out of a very small number if you actually get a unified, action to do mass civil disobedience. But that's a tough thing to organize around, even if you do have a leadership that's on board with it, much less if you have leadership that's actively opposed to it. And so I think, and frankly, on the question of a new party too, like, like, I wish I could say that like the unions we're at the cutting edge of pushing for a new party or whatever. Like that would be a great situation, but you know, unfortunately, like the unions are the one force I can think of on the working class or left sort of arena that have the resources to launch a viable third party overnight if they decided to. You know, in a typical presidential election year, the unions spend, you know, $400 million on Democratic campaigns and mobilize 400,000 volunteer hours for Democratic candidates. Yeah. You know, those are the types of resources that, you know, single-handedly, you know, you could form a viable party with that, you know, if you wanted to. And so it is a question of political will, and it's the type of thing that it would be great if you could leverage that. Unfortunately, I think that that's going to lag behind. And in the early stages, you know, I'm for forming a new party, but I think like in the early stages, it's only going to be a few of the most far left unions that are going to be open to something, to doing something like that. And it'll have to have some proven staying power before others start looking at it. But that said, I think there are unions like National Nurses United that, you know, have been willing to go out there and make strong points about the need for a third party or expose the limitations of both the Democrats and Republicans. So they do exist, but they're few and far between, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is in any way a multi-year. It's a long process. When you're talking about the marshaling of the kind of resources that you're talking about for the Democratic Party, it just makes me shake my head and get pissed off, because it's amazing how much power there is there and how it's just absolutely fucking wasted on now organizing for Joe Biden, you know, like just what, I mean, a guy who said to a group of bankers, remember, nothing will fundamentally change. And you're going to muster, you know, $400 million and 400,000 people to organize around that because, because it's not Trump.
Yeah.
As if Joe Biden's going to do anything for labor unions that Donald Trump would do.
I mean, I get and I'm sympathetic to why someone would want to try and do whatever they thought they needed to do to stop Trump. But to me, like, you know, this is not where we should be focusing our efforts. Like, you know, whatever. I'm not gonna critique somebody for taking 5 seconds to tick a box for Joe Biden, but I will absolutely critique a union for the union movement for spending all resources on propping up Joe Biden.
So,
like,
all right, so
could go anything, and it would be more useful. You know? Right.
Yes. Jeez. Like the number of struggles that could help, you know, on the ground struggles as compared to, I mean, you know, how much that stuff is tipping the scales. I do wonder. But let's talk about some long-term visions for the future of DSA. So, you know, obviously we're grabbing our crystal balls and we're, you know, doing a bit of fortune telling, which, you know, from Marx on down, socialists have always been really good at making predictions about how things are going to go. So with all of that in mind, where do you see like DSA, and where, like, maybe in two ways, where do you see it, and where do you think it will go, and where do you think it should go in some time intervals? So like in 6 months, in 1 year, in 5 years, in 10 years, where do you see, and where should DSA go?
I mean, this is going to be highly conditional. I mean, I think especially given the crazy times we're in, like it's virtually impossible to say with any certainty what anything looks like 5 or 10 years from now, I feel like.
These are very precedented times. We know exactly what's going
on. So that said, I think I have decent answers for the 6 month and 1 year stuff, but I mean, frankly, you know, by 5 or 10 years, like, I don't even know if DSA will be the like if it'll exist anymore, if it'll exist in its form. And I don't say that because of any, you know, like, maybe it will, maybe it won't, but it's just there's too many factors. Like it could be that everything in society has just moved so far past that it's not a thing anymore, or whatever, or maybe it merges with some other thing that comes about, and there's some other, formation. So speaking of DSA as an organization on that time frame is virtually impossible. So I'll have to be more broad about the movement as a whole and not be able to speak about DSA as an organization. But in my ideal world, in DSA would spend the next 6 months organizing nationally coordinated discussions on the idea of launching a democratic socialist party, and try and work out as many of the kinks as possible, get as much buy-in and creative ideas and whatever from different layers of people, get messaging down and whatever, so that literally the moment this election season's over and Joe Biden or Donald Trump or maybe whoever brought in to replace Joe Biden when the sexual assault allegations just torpedo him, or when something else happens. I don't know. Yeah. Who knows?
Don't worry. He's categorically denied that they happened, which is, I guess, a way of dealing with it.
Yeah. So anyway, when whatever wholly inadequate politician takes office in November, literally that, or not takes office, but gets elected in November, that at that moment, you can immediately say, let's right now build the alternative so we're never faced with a choice like this ever again. Let's start right now when we have the maximum amount of time between now and the next presidential election. And let's start building power and, reaching out to the contacts in the union movement, in the wider activist circles and stuff, and just try and start pulling together some conferences or something like that for early next year that has delegates coming out of the labor unions, out of the different movement organizations that are interested and can, that represents a swath that has real social weight in society. Because I think that's what you need to make a viable party that can, stick around, is to have actual, that it's not just a random assortment of eclectic lefties coming together, but it's a coalition of organizations that have social weight. And so I think, if in my ideal world, DSA would have those discussions over the next 6 months, be ready to hit the ground running as soon as the time is right, which to me is, basically putting the word out publicly as soon as the election season's over, and early next year having conferences with delegates from as many organized groups as possible to try and bring together the outlines of a new party that could then immediately, run candidates at local levels in the next set of elections, and try and start testing some of these things out and building getting ballot lines for itself and getting some of that structural stuff in place, and could, it doesn't, and then on top of that, continue to do all the fights that we're already going to be doing, one way or another around issues of housing and the environment and women's rights and immigrant rights and so forth. But have, if you could go to those as, a group that sees itself as a party and is seen by the wider community as a party, to me that does have a different quality to it if you're organizing in all these struggles in that capacity than if you're, just an organization. And so it sends the idea that you're sort of linking up, you're actively running these struggles in a political way and linking it up to this broader political context. And hopefully you'd be able to build your base for that party that way, by showing up and representing communities in social movements at the same time as doing so on those issues electorally. And to me, again, in an ideal world, this party would have a model of, only where candidates only take the average wage of the people they represent, so they're not sort of bound by ties of mutual privilege to the capitalists and their politicians, and also to sort of weed out the people who are doing it for careerist reasons.
Money.
Yeah. Because the fact of the matter is, if you do succeed in building a viable third party, that's not like the end of the struggle. That's the beginning of a new phase of the struggle. And, the left wing of the Democrats will become the right wing of that party, insofar as you succeed in
pulling any of them away. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and so there will be, battles within that party for what is it and how does it work, and to combat the careerist elements, and to combat and to have the discussions between the different trends of what are we really trying to do, and how are we using this? Like, do we think we're going to make the change we need to make just through getting our people elected, or is this a way of building power in a more fundamental grassroots level that we can leverage, in ways separate from the ballot box? I think that question of what is this party is going to have to be continually revisited over and over again, as it grows in influence. If it hopefully grows in, these are the problems that will be posed even in the best case scenario, that you succeed in launching a new party, you succeed in gaining influence. It's still going to, come with all these questions of what do you do with that, and sort of keeping your eye on the prize of the movement for socialism, and not sort of getting led astray by whatever shiny thing is happening in the moment, or getting too scared of whatever scary thing's happening in the moment.
Right, because there are lessons in history of large socialist organizations even getting in positions of power and overseeing the destruction of socialist revolution. So it's very, I agree with you. I think it's, for me, I've argued for the starting of a third party. I think that's exactly what's necessary for all the reasons that you're talking about. But there is a fear that then the party would become its own raison d'etre, and that is where the socialist part of that party goes to die, because then it becomes another bourgeois party. It is the exemplar of the risk that the libertarian socialists would potentially, that would be the position they take, that you end up as the SPD.
Yeah, and I think, I think that that is a very real risk, and not to be downplayed whatsoever. But the only guard against that is to have a genuinely broad-based, democratically run, with true democratic bottom-up culture party, because it's really easy for isolated individuals at the top, even with the best of intentions, even if they are only taking the average worker's wage, whatever, to get caught up in the immediate needs of the immediate questions that are posed, and not be able to see the bigger picture and look beyond that to the struggle for socialism or whatever, where you're just like, okay, this immediate question up for a vote and this immediate reform or whatever, and throwing all your long-term stuff under the bus for being able to win this short-term reform or whatever. And so it's very easy if you're just some isolated individual, and so that's why you need to feel like you really have a grassroots base at your back pushing you, and know that you'll be held accountable by them, and also that you'll continue to be inspired by them and ultimately held accountable to them, because it's much harder to sway the working class masses politically than it is to sway a few individuals at the top. And so as long as the party stays rooted in the working masses, then it will have a built-in defense mechanism. And to me, that's like the key reason for democracy more than anything else. It's not some, I'm not religious about it. It's not like a reason in and of itself, and it's not the reason for living or for organizing or whatever, but it is indispensable as air to a body. I think if you're trying to build something robust that can stand the test of time and not, sort of degenerate in those circumstances, there's no individual who's reliable enough in the absence of that to, to put all your faith in or rest on no set of politicians. But if you're talking about an entire social class in society, then you can start, that's organized and politically conscious and making decisions for itself, then that you can, rest on. That doesn't just blow with every changing wind in the same way.
Do you think, as you were talking, it came to me in one sense, and I've already, argued this while we were talking, that DSA has an interesting and rich democratic culture sort of already. At the same time, it's got baggage. It has the daddy's DSA baggage that does affect its organization and will have an effect on the future of the organization to some degree or another, especially if DSA were to sort of refound as the third party that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So how do you see, do you argue that DSA should simply relaunch itself as the third party and take along the baggage, whatever, it's not that bad, it's not going to be a hindrance, it's okay, there's already a democratic culture, so we can use that and maintain that? Or do you argue that there should be a new party of which DSA is a major, founding member or tendency within, that will then have a sort of, it'll be a tabula rasa a bit, and you'll be able to build in the democratic culture from the ground up. It will not have the baggage, but it will have the fact that it's sort of new and not have any of the institutional structure and history and things like that. So what you lose in baggage, you gain in not having any blemishes, but what you lose in your organizational history, you then have to remake. And so, I don't know, where do you fall?
I think the distinction you're posing is I tend to think that there's not actually a difference between those scenarios in the way that you're painting it. I don't think throwing out the baggage is an option, and I don't think and I also don't think that relaunching as a broader party without there being a certain re-examining and a blank slate aspect to it being added is possible. I think the question of whether it is framed as a relaunching or as a launching a new party, is sort of just
doesn't matter.
It's what people say, semantics, I think. Either way, I think the task is you need to launch something that is more conscious of itself as a party, that has mechanisms of accountability, that has a platform, that has standards for elected officials, that has a wider social base than the current DSA, bringing in unions and other organizations in a formal way, trying to merge these forces into it. So one way of framing that conceptually would be, relaunching the DSA and opening up it and broadening its base in the way that would be necessary to do that. Another would be to say that you're launching a new party of which DSA is one key constituent or whatever. I think to me the only real distinction between those two is if you relaunch as a broader party, then you have the possibility that actually DSA maintains itself as a separate affiliate member of the party, basically, the DSA still is a thing inside the party, versus just sort of
becoming the party.
Yeah, exactly. So to me that's the only way in which the scenarios are different. One is, DSA is the tent and then other organizations can go into it or whatever. The other situation is that you build this tent and then DSA is by far the biggest thing that goes into it or whatever. So it's not that there's no difference between those, but I don't think it's like what you're posing. I think either way you have the baggage and something new, and that there's no way around that.
Getting your crystal ball out again, do you think Bernie Sanders would join this new party?
I don't want to totally rule it out because I do think he genuinely grapples with things and tries to, do what he thinks is right or whatever, but he's also remarkably consistent on most things, and has been, his track record has been very clear. And even when he, even in Vermont, when he, wins as an independent or whatever, it's not like he ever joined or formed like, a new party around
a
that.
new party.
And so I just see, it could be that it's just so new and dynamic and viable and whatever, and captures exactly what he's looking for, whatever, that he can't resist, that is, he sees the necessity of orienting to it and does. But that would be a new thing, I guess. Like, so far, he's caucused with the Democrats through his career, and I think, to me, if there was a moment where like he would have seen the need to do something like that, it would have been,
2016.
2016, exactly, after losing that time. Like, the basis was really clearly laid to go start something new, in my opinion, but yeah, it didn't happen. And actually, I still think even today, if he was going to, it would like, if Bernie Sanders called for this new third party, it could happen immediately. Like, but I don't think he's going to do that. Like, I think it's basically ruled out at this point that he's going to call for something like that. But, could he be dragged along after the fact, after it's already proved itself? Yeah, maybe. Like, I don't, if you did start seeing senators breaking from the Democratic Party to join that, like, I'm sure he'd be among the first, but like, in terms of whether he's in on the ground floor, I think that's highly dubious.
Yeah, so you could see Bernie might be among the first to defect, but it'd be unlikely that he would be the first and only defection.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I tend to think that you'd get some other congressional people to defect at the same time.
Yeah, and so hopefully some high profile and relatively well-known people as to give a boost or a shot in the arm.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, many of them would probably be doing so for mixed reasons or whatever. Like, I can either be this marginal figure or whatever, like, inside this party that totally hates my politics or whatever, or I can be this like big fish, within this tiny new pond and whatever.
Which is not necessarily terrible, so long as there is that accountability, between the elected representatives in the party.
Yep, and that the party doesn't, get in the habit of just sort of, doing, getting starstruck and following,
Right. Don't do what the Labour Party did and have the fucking parliamentary Labour Party and then the rank and file Labour Party, which I've never understood why they did that.
Yeah.
And that just, in some ways I've made the joke, or I made the claim that we call it the American Labour Party, but you definitely don't want to follow in the footsteps of the Labour Party in terms of dividing the party between those who have the power and those who don't, because that's the opposite. I think it's the opposite example of the one that you need for a third party. All right, look, I won't make you give the 5 or 10 year estimate because, like you said, it's basically impossible.
Well,
but
I will just say, as a movement, like, what I in 5 or 10 years is that instead of just a smattering of candidates endorsed by DSA that are across the country, that you have 100 or 200 candidates that have been run consciously as conscious socialists run by a new party, that have been elected and are testing their ideas out and are hopefully leading movements in communities and things like that, and where you can start to really see that this thing isn't going away, and you start to have some real institutional power for working people and things like that. But the reason it's so hard, even with that, to say what you're going to get is, like, you just never know when there's going to be some totally explosive, game-changing thing that happens that massively accelerates or massively sets back developments. And so it's tough to say. But, like, yeah, based on what you can say about the trajectory so far, I think it would be great if there was such a new party and it was democratic and it had number of successful elections. I think it's also just prognosticating wise. I think you're going to see other similar features break out on the right as well. I think the future is one of 4 parties, or maybe it's 3 parties and the center 2 parties merge. I don't know. But yeah, I think 10 years from now, maybe. I mean, I don't know. It's tough to put a timeline on it, but I think I think in the next decade or 2, you're looking at 3 or 4 parties, or probably 4 parties possibly consolidating to 3. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's not an unrealistic expectation. I mean, I just don't. To me, I don't see how the current system maintains itself on the sort of left and the right parts of both parties. It seems to me that there's quite a difference between the center, of which traditional Republicans and traditional Democrats fall into, and then you have the insurgents on both sides. And it's very difficult on both, like within both the Democratic and Republican parties, to even maintain order, which in some ways is ultimately the point when you're only a parliamentary party. The whole goal is to maintain strict coalitions in voting, and you're not able to do that, or your parties are being pulled in the way that the center will revolt. So yeah, it'll be very interesting to see. I'd love this. I don't know. I wouldn't love what the right would produce, because to me that's like a fascist party.
Right.
Because especially with the downturn in the economy because of coronavirus and all those kinds of things, as history always shows, the 2 people who benefit from these kind of crises are lefties and righties, fascists and socialists. And so that makes it ever more important for us to maintain focus and organization towards a legitimate goal, which I think the founding of a new party is a legitimate goal that we can all work towards. Because if we don't and we lose that ball, it's going to get passed to the fascists.
Yeah,
and we have to.
That's such an important point. Is that I think the center is going to empty out one way or the other. With or without us, the traditional parties are going to continue losing support, and that's because they rely on stable or growing and expanding capitalism to maintain a decently healthy system for themselves. But we are looking forward to there is no thing that we can look to on the horizon that's going to allow capitalism to sort of resolve its crises and contradictions. It's going to get it out of this mess. Like the last thing that was able to do that really was World War II. And they were able to, on the basis, you did have crowded international markets and economic catastrophe and countries expanding domains overlapping each other in ways that couldn't be contained or whatever. And so you could, by having massive destruction of resources worldwide, you're able, which even if you could, I don't think we would want to repeat. Level of destruction, but that was the only basis on which you could get the post-war boom, was the massive destruction of a productive capacity that took place during the war. And so there's nothing like that on the horizon that we can look to as being something that would clear the space for capitalism to sort of start fresh and prune the overgrown areas or whatever. Like it just is international markets getting more and more tight and clogged, and it's going to push pressures toward backward stuff like protectionism or whatever, and sort of heighten the inter-imperialist tensions, and you're just gonna it's gonna be a continued race to the bottom and crisis after crisis. And I think in that context, there's just no basis for the 2-party system to stay intact. It is the longest standing, regime of parties, of any country that I'm aware of in the world. In terms, I don't think there is any other set of parties where it's the same parties vying for power now as were vying for power during the American Civil War or whatever.
Right.
I think it's just not. There's been a shakeup everywhere else, and the reason that there wasn't here was because of the post-war boom, and the fact that there America didn't have to make the choice between, other countries had to make the choice between either you serve corporations or you give in to workers' demands, but you can't do both or whatever. And here that wasn't true. You could do both, if there was enough space, profit margin wise, to just, we can, anytime workers start to rise up, we can throw money at the problem and make it go away while still making more money than everyone else in the world. So that those days aren't coming back, I guess is what I'm saying. So there's no basis to stabilize the.
We're once again, approaching that question that Rosa Luxemburg put forth, which is whether it goes socialism or barbarism, because there are times when the system is at a point where you have to make that choice. And it's been the case previously that the choice has been made for barbarism, whether that be war or fascism or what have you. And I think, especially as we see the looming climate crisis come, this moment of socialism or barbarism is again ever present, and we don't have that long before the consequences of the inaction of the last 100 years, let's say.
And that's like when she said barbarism, I think she meant something more like a Mad Max scenario, and so
that's what we're looking at. Yeah, exactly.
We're very aware of that possibility, and so socialism or barbarism in the very classic sense.
Exactly, and so it I think it behooves all of us socialists to get a bit of a sober analysis and recognize the forces that are potentially against us in terms of the potential forming of a fascist party and its competition with us for vying of power, and that we can't sit on our hands in this moment and in some ways do nothing or simply theorize, but that we have to make decisions about what organizations we join and what things that we do. And I think, again, I would just say for me personally, there are, that you've presented several compelling reasons why DSA is the organization that we should choose to go into and organize with.
I just want to make a plug real quick for a petition that's going around for DSA to have a discussion on launching a democratic socialist party. This is very off the cuff, and I'm not the one who launched it or whatever, but I signed it, and I think it's important because I obviously believe in doing that. So definitely, if you want to search like Democratic Socialist Party petition, I'm sure it'll be the first thing that you see or whatever. But that said, you don't have to be a member of DSA to sign the petition. So,
gotcha. Okay. Cool. All right. Yeah. So check out that petition, sign that petition. I think if people are listening to The Sensible Socialist and like what I'm hearing, this is something very much on the vein of what I've been talking about for over a year now. So, hopefully they're interested and will go sign that petition. So, Brandon, thanks a lot for being on here and for giving your perspective, and let's do it again. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right. See you next time.